thinking engagement is really crucial for a successful program and associations, especially. It's a big value add and can be pretty complex and challenging to master. Can you start by defining, okay, what does successful engagement look like in the learning context, and talk through some strategies and maybe stories of how associations and educators can kind of adopt these methods to boost learner engagement, involvement, motivation? I'd love to hear if you have any specific examples too, maybe anonymized.
Well, I'll start at least by defining learner engagement because, it is kind of one of these soft terms, right? Engagement, like we sort of all say, yeah, it's important, but, what exactly do we mean by it? And there's a definition that's based on a definition from the Glossary of Education Reform. It's modified it a little bit because they're very focused on more like K through 12 education. So like they talk about students and things like that. But so for me, learner engagement is the degree of attention, curiosity, interest, optimism, and passion learners show when learning, which extends to the level of motivation they have to learn and progress. So obviously that's a big mouthful, but for me, like if you break it down, they talk about learner engagement being the degree of attention, curiosity, interest. Those three to me speak to cognitive engagement, like sort of our mental engagement with whatever's being taught. They also talk about optimism and passion, which I think get to the emotional connection that learners feel with what's being taught. And then they talk about that learners show these things when learning. So that's behavioral, right? Like what are they going to do? So it's like about thinking, feeling, and doing. And I think if you keep that definition with those three aspects, it can kind of really help a lot, because I think sometimes we think that doing is an indication of engagement, right? So like, we'll be in that webinar and we'll have people like share something in the chat. And so you want to see everybody doing it. But if it's really just about like where they're joining from, then it may not actually be kind of tied to engagement, or it may not be a super important part. It may sort of set the scene for deeper and better engagement a little bit later in the webinar. So it might be serving a purpose. But the other thing too is that sometimes we think, oh, if people don't show something in the moment, they're not engaged. Well, they might be thinking about it. They might be feeling about it, but they're not yet to that point of demonstrating it. So I think kind of keeping those three things in mind. And I do think ideally you kind of touch a learner in all three of, you get them thinking, you get them feeling, and you get them doing. To have all three is where you really want to be. But to appreciate, sometimes you might only kind of get two, or even one, but to build off of that. And then Kyle, even as you were asking the question, I think just there's an acknowledgement of the engagement not just happening during whatever the learning experience is, during that seminar or webinar or session or course. It's also what happens before. So what can you do to get people thinking about the content, or feeling excited about the content, or even doing something like pre-reading before they show up for that experience? Then what can you do during that learning experience to further that engagement, and then after? So what can you do as follow-up to, again, kind of continue to keep them thinking about it, get them to do things, and also then still that emotional connection, helping them just remain excited about potentially applying that concept. So that's kind of at the high level. I think there are lots of examples about kind of how that can play out. And I know like we're hearing from organizations that they are thinking about engagement broadly. Like I know we had a conversation recently where someone was talking about a conference where it came up about like needing to have child care facilities, like where the people, like the parents who are attending the conference, could change diapers, for example. So it's like, in theory, that has kind of, or at some level, you might think that has nothing to do with learning. But if that parent is there and trying to learn, actually being able to take care of that child they've brought along with them, that's very important. So kind of thinking very broadly about engagement.
Yeah, it's that the full sort of learning experience and the experience around learning that I think is really critical. Are there any other considerations you'd suggest or stories you can share from your work at Tagoras in terms of engagement, in the world of professional development, continuing education, before we continue?
I think I'll offer one example from our own experience, but it sort of relates back to, I think, a practice that organizations that are in the business of continuing education and professional development have to be really focused on. And that's really working with your subject matter experts, your presenters, your facilitators, because they are your ambassadors in all of this. And if they don't sort of understand this need to look at the experience broadly, to understand the context that's going to allow for engagement and that's going to allow for effective learning, then they're not going to be able to really represent you effectively and deliver the types of learning experiences that are going to ultimately have that kind of engagement. I mean, something we do with our own events, because we do offer, different types of education ourselves, is we actually spend quite a bit of time with our presenters before the events actually happen. So we'll have an initial content call that is really purely about the content. What are they going to be covering in a particular session? But then we'll have, a call after that that's really more of a dry run. And in both of those cases, we're really working with them to help them as much as possible understand and be able to connect with the audience in the most meaningful way, because we know things about our audience that they're just not going to know, most likely. And we can help find those points of connection that are going to help to create that engagement. And we generally do end up doing a lot of tweaking with them around their presentations. You might try this here instead of that. You might want to re-emphasize this bit of content more. You might want to incorporate more stories here or more stories there. We do that with our own events. And that's something that we also, work with and recommend with the clients we are serving. Most organizations will have some sort of written guidelines or orientation, usually logistically tailored for their speakers, their presenters, but they aren't necessarily spending a lot of time with them around this sort of engagement question and how do they help them be more engaging and help them to be more effective as presenters and facilitators.
I love that. So Jeff, you mentioned helping organizations make their learning effective and their programs effective. One of the questions that I am very curious to hear about, maintaining and sort of making the programs that these organizations have around learning effective is definitely a challenge, and it can mean many different things. Pythagoras said, there are two sides to every question. And, with that in mind here, what are some of the major challenges that professional associations, different sort of education providers face in maintaining and upholding an effective learning program? And what does that really mean to you guys?
First of all, a gold star for quoting Pythagoras there. I'm not sure anybody's ever quoted Pythagoras to me in an interview. So you're either a philosopher or you did your homework or both. So yeah, the types of issues, well, I mean, the types of organizations that we work with, most of them are nonprofits, because most associations are organized as nonprofits, not all of them. When we don't work solely in the association world, we do go beyond that to work with other types of organizations that provide learning and education to adult lifelong learners. But they're all pretty mission driven in what they're doing. They want to have that kind of, impact and provide that kind of access we're talking about. But they're also businesses. They aren't internal corporate training departments who can just say, take this training, this is required of you. They have to actually convince people to come and learn with them. The major issues that we tackle with them are actually kind of encapsulated in the tagline for Tagoras: reach, revenue, and impact. And I'll say that's not a tagline that we sort of cooked up by sitting around a table and saying, what can we do that sounds clever from a marketing standpoint? It took us 10 years and a lot of experience to arrive at that tagline, because that's what we kept seeing as the issues we were dealing with: reach, revenue, and impact. And I'll just break those down quickly. I mean, reach has to do with being able to actually get to the learners that you want to be able to help and get to that right group of learners. And oftentimes organizations, they may not have a great understanding of the needs that they're really trying to serve with those learners. They may not be communicating or positioning themselves well with those learners. They may not have the right technology in place to be able to reach those learners effectively. So there's a lot that will help them wrestle with around that whole issue of reach. How do we actually get to the people we're trying to serve? And then that second one, revenue, even though a lot of them are nonprofits, they generally have to at least break even, if not have positive net revenue. And in many cases, either that's not happening or they're seeing downward pressure on their revenue. Things aren't going the way that they used to. Not as many people are showing up for the meetings or whatever the case might be. So we help them to tackle those issues. And it sort of relates back to reach. We might look at, are you actually offering the right types of learning experiences? Are you pricing them optimally? Do you actually have the resources to achieve what you're trying to achieve from a revenue standpoint? So we'll help them break that down. And then finally, that last one, impact, out of the trio: reach, revenue, and impact. I mean, that's probably the one that's dearest to our heart. So it goes back to what we we're just talking about. We really want to help these organizations have a positive impact on their learners. In a lot of cases, though, that's not really being measured very well. You have sort of the traditional smile sheets that, you get whenever you finish a conference session or that sort of thing. And those are important because they generally measure if learners like the experience. Do they think it was a good thing? And because those learners are essentially customers, you want to know that, but it doesn't really tell you anything about whether they actually learned something and will apply that, in whatever context they're supposed to apply it in. So we work with them on that. How are you going to be able to measure this more effectively going forward? What's the perception of effectiveness versus the reality? Where you're having success, are you communicating that well? Because that kind of circles back to that reach area. If you can say, yes, we're actually moving the dial with our learning experiences, you're much more likely to connect with new learners and bring the old learners back. You're much more likely to meet your revenue goals. So it's sort of a virtuous cycle, that whole reach, revenue, impact.
I love that. I was going to mention it if you didn't, in terms of what do efficient programs look like? What does success look like? That's great. I'd love to dive in a little more on that too. Maybe picking one of those tenets, and if you have any story that you can share. There's often cases when we work with organizations, associations or otherwise, oftentimes they come with one challenge, and it's sort of like the Henry Ford adage about people, if you ask people what they wanted, they'd say faster horses.
Mhm.
I'd love to hear a story of when do organizations come to you sort of asking for the faster horses, but when you really dig into underlying issues behind the sort of surface symptoms, what do you end up coming out with as the sort of deeper, rooted things causing those issues, and solutions to those that end up bringing that sort of end result?
Yeah, there are scenarios we see all the time, where an organization will come to us with one issue where they're either just really feeling the pain, or maybe they're bored. Somebody said, well, we need to be doing this because I heard about, this is the type of thing organizations are doing. So they might come to us and say, we need to create a microlearning library today. Microlearning is what everybody is doing right now. And that, of course, that may be true, but we need to go find out. And we've had multiple instances where we've gone out and looked, and yeah, there might be some value at this point in doing some microlearning, but actually this particular audience really still, believe it or not, loves those long webinar lectures. And, if we just did a little bit of repositioning and did some things to help improve the quality of them, you're actually kind of already on track here. That would be an example of a product sort of situation. We often have organizations come to us and say, we've got pricing issues, we're overpricing, we're underpricing, we don't know how to price. And again, that may be true, but often when we go and look at that, they actually have an awareness issue. Like, people aren't buying because they just don't even know that stuff is there. And you have to address that before you address anything else. So those are the types of things that we'll run into all the time. And we always just say, you need to look at actual behaviors in your market. Just don't go out and ask people what they prefer, what they think they want, because they rarely know, for certain. You have to look at what they're actually doing and sort of where that's pointing you, and then start testing some things out. Whatever you do, don't just go out and build it and expect they're going to come. That happens all the time. For example, with something like a certification or a certificate program, maybe your audience, maybe you see some signs that that's something that would be good to do in your marketplace. But with something like that, for example, the first thing we're going to say is, have you talked to the employers? If people actually earn this, certificate or certification, are the employers going to value it? Because if they don't, then it's probably not going to be worth much in the marketplace.
Right. So Lisa, anything you want to add on that one? Then I'll move to the next question.
I would say that very often what we end up doing with organizations initially is diagnosis. And, Kyle, you were sharing that you thought for a while you wanted to be a doctor. I mean, there's so much about just really trying to understand an organization situation, because often they will come to us with kind of an alternative. They're already down the path of this is what we want to do. This is what we need to do. We need help doing it. When maybe if you back up and you really understand the situation and diagnose it properly, there might be a different alternative that would provide the same results. So diagnosis is a big part of it.
That's great. And you had mentioned an example of an organization coming to you looking for, hey, we need to integrate microlearning right now. This is where things are changing in the industry. We need to do this. One of the things that you probably have a huge advantage of working with so many different education programs is seeing trends in the industry, seeing what is a trend versus what's a fad, and what's actually working. I'd love to hear, just at a high level overall, for the continuing education and professional development market, what are some of the biggest shifts and trends you're seeing now that you think will have a lasting impact that organizations should know about?
Well, I feel like it'll be no surprise that I'm going to say artificial intelligence is definitely a shift and a trend that I think has will have huge impact on CE and professional development, just how learning happens in general. We did a survey of learning businesses, which includes a lot of trade and professional associations that are offering education out there. And we asked them kind of, I think, about 15 areas and where are they planning to focus in 2024. Artificial intelligence was top of the list for them. So, I think with the introduction of ChatGPT, it really got everyone's attention. I think there's a lot of interest, a lot of focus on the possibilities there. I will say, though, right now, it does feel like it's a lot of thinking and a lot of possibilities and not a lot of like doing and real clearly strategically focused execution. I think there's still big questions around exactly how best to integrate artificial intelligence and what it might mean. And I see at least two ways in which it can help. It's on the kind of quantitatively and qualitatively. So quantitatively, it can be about efficiency, right? Like how can we kind of use AI to just get what we're already doing in terms of putting out e-learning, for example? How can we use that to do that more efficiently? And then there's the qualitative side, which is actually how can we begin to do that and offer learning that might be kind of higher quality or do something different. So for example, how could we really leverage artificial intelligence to potentially finally deliver on some of those holy grails like just-in-time learning or personalization or things like that? So that's certainly one shift in trend that I think is pretty top of mind for everyone right now. Another one I would kind of put under the umbrella of an increased focus beyond content. I think that a lot of organizations are beginning to understand that it's more than just kind of what the content that goes into an e-learning course or the content that goes into a conference session or a webinar session, and that there's so much more that's wrapped up in learning because it is this process and not just this event. And I think some of the ways that that's playing out are things like pathways. So how can you help your learners or potential learners actually understand out of the content that you have available, which should they take advantage of? What is it going to help them do at the end or at the end of even several courses, for example? I think tied up in that is credentials, right? So kind of potential for stackable credentials. So if you are going down a pathway, at the end of the pathway, do you have some sort of certificate that you've sort of led to because you completed those courses? And again, what is that credential going to do for you in terms of employability or keeping your skills and your knowledge up to date? I think even we're seeing more interest in things like nudges. So again, kind of outside of that specific course, what can you do to check back in with learners and help make sure that they're remembering to apply or try things that they learned in a course? So those are a couple that kind of pop to mind for me. And Jeff, you probably have some other thoughts, or you might have some other thoughts.
I think I would probably just pick up on what you're saying, that, yes, increasingly learners, even if they're not consciously aware of it, are looking to organizations, people who can be guides, who can be curators, who can help them make sense of what they need to be doing at this point. Because you hear constantly about upskilling, reskilling, lifelong learning, but what does that actually mean for the individual? And to the extent that an organization can be that guide, can be that point of reference for them, they become increasingly valuable in the marketplace. Related to all of this, we've seen a surge in interest in digital credentialing. That relates to kind of the pathways concept as well, but being able to take these sort of smaller units and potentially stack them. We feel like we're seeing a lot more progress with that in the academic realm of continuing education, professional development than we've seen with associations, but we're seeing growth in both places. And we feel like there's a lot of ground for collaboration between academia and associations around things like digital credentials, particularly as it relates to one of the other areas that we're seeing a lot of growth in is just focus on workforce development and workforce maintenance, and a lot more sort of structured thinking and collaboration starting to happen around that again, as we all wrestle with this idea that we have to just be continuously learning and shifting throughout our lifetime. So how do we manage that effectively, and who needs to be involved in that? And certainly any continuing education and professional development provider has a role to play in that.
Yeah, that's good. The going beyond the content is one of my favorite things there too. And I think engagement and learning is more than just consuming the content itself. It's a full life cycle, right? And I think the best organizations look at it at those different levels and different stages, culturally for the whole organization, sort of before, during, after, consuming content, how it actually applies applies to the learner's day-to-day work, and then sort of ongoing nudging is, how people remember things is, not just consuming it once, as we all know from attending school and looking back at some of the formulas that we learned in math and were tested on successfully, but don't actually remember at all today. Um, so let's talk a little bit. We work with a lot of certification programs. Some of them have required continuing education in order to recertify. Some of them are just certificates, which is one-time educational requirements, and combining those, often it's even different leaders sometimes of a certification program and a different leader of education programs within the organization. I'd love to hear, how do you believe that certifications can integrate these two effectively between the learning initiatives and the certification sort of management within these bodies or associations?
Yeah, I would start by saying I feel like we're seeing somewhat of a less strict separation between certification and education than we used to. I mean, it's still there, and depending on the governing body and that sort of thing, it may be stronger in some places than others, but there's certainly more communication between the two and more of an understanding between the two than what was often the case in the past. And I mean, my perspective is that a certification program really should provide, let's say, clarity, cohesion, and purpose. So it should make it clear what the relevant learning experiences are. So, where you're going with that certification or even a certificate, any credential, that should help to then feed back into what does it make sense to learn here. And then it should also provide sort of an organizational approach or framework for the learning experiences. And then ultimately it needs to align those learning experiences to a clear need, whether that's in the employment market, which is going to be, in most cases, that's where it's going to be, but wherever the certificate is going to make use of the certification. So, it's helping to determine these are the learning experiences. This is how we sort of handle the organization and the sequencing of them. And this is kind of the value that they ultimately lead to, what is going to enable the learner and whoever the learner serves to be able to, a specific instance that I've seen of that in recent history. I had the good fortune for several years, I think it was close to 8 years, to serve on the board of the of NIGP, the Institute for Public Procurement. And actually during that time, we sort of took a certification program back in-house, or really we stood up a new certification program that was separate from one that we had in the past. So we kind of got to rethink everything, about how that was going to work and how it related to the education. And one of the things that really sort of grew out of that was a notion of pathways. Celisa had mentioned pathways in earlier comments, but learning pathways that really helped to support that certification. So the two are very much in line with each other. And we really mapped out, I mean, there was matrix of all of the different competencies and knowledge areas and the different learning experiences and how they ultimately mapped out to the certification. And in fact, NIGP actually branded this whole program as Pathways because it's very much about that. So that idea that here is what we're trying to achieve in the end is a procurement professional who has the knowledge and skills to really excel in the profession. And we've mapped it back to these are the learning experiences that are needed to support doing that effectively. Here's how those experiences are organized. Here's the value that they're ultimately leading to once we have tested you and certified that you in fact can do these things.
Yeah, that's beautiful. The pathways is a very interesting thing, and the stacking, I think in most certification programs that we've seen, a lot of them require very specific either topics to be included or different types of credits, sometimes pre-approved by the association or internally offered by the association. I'd love to hear if you have any examples or stories of balancing for a certification program, balancing the education offering and sort of acceptance or approval between internally provided education and external, third parties outside of the certifying body themselves.
I mean, we definitely see many instances of organizations that they're doing both, that are going to have the ability for their internal continuing education to support the certification and have the ability for external providers. And one of the organizations we work with, for example, is the American Speech Hearing Language Association, and they have a very robust internal continuing education unit that produces all sorts of content that does qualify for supporting the certification in that field. But they also have I think 500 plus providers out there who can do the exact same thing, and the main thing is that the same standards have to be applied to both. I mean, they have to be very clear, what the standards for acceptance are, and the internal team has to meet those standards just as much as the external team does. They have to be clearly and objectively communicated. And that's one of those cases where the sort of line between the certification and the education is, very clearly drawn. I mean, certainly they're in communication with each other, but you can't have the education just purely serve the test. Obviously, or they can't have knowledge within ACEA that would put them at an advantage over the external providers, which is going to be the case. I think it should be the case in any instance where you've got both internal and external providers to support the education required to support a certification.
Yeah, that's great. We work with some ASHA certification providers or certification holders as well. So I've heard some about their program. Celisa, did you want to add something?
I think this gets back to the comments earlier about kind of thinking beyond the quote content. I mean, so like if you are an association and you happen to kind of oversee that certification, and then you have your own educational offerings that are supporting it, and you have competitors that are providing it. I mean, it gets back to what can you offer that's kind of, beyond the content. I mean, you want your content to be excellent, but hopefully you're not just competing on course versus course. It's that, we're providing this whole range of other resources that support you, or the association that focuses on this. They have like a compelling, unique value proposition to potentially lean into and really stand out. And I think from a learner standpoint, it's actually kind of maybe reassuring to know that like I have choices, and that it feels a little less like, I have to go here and get it, So I think it's a potential good thing to have to kind of wrestle with competition, and hopefully helps those organizations really think through what else do they provide, what else beyond the course.
And I'll add to that. I mean, ASHA is a very forward-thinking organization, and they are thinking that way. I mean, they're really thinking about their value as a overall learning ecosystem, of which the continuing education and the support for the certification is just one piece of it. But, they want their learners to value and appreciate being part of that larger ecosystem. So they're really focused on building that value and communicating that value.
I think it's a part of any thriving ecosystem to have a competition, and it's actually a good, in setting up a new certification program or trying to grow one. I think it's a good sign that if there is existing, resources and education out there, it means there's a market, right? It means there's interest from employers and from the professionals themselves. That I think related. So partnerships can be a game changer. Sometimes you can be friendly with your competition without partnering, but sometimes it's good to actually create partnerships with different types of organizations within the association world, within the educator world. What advice would you give to different organizations sort of seeking to create success and mutually beneficial collaborations within their own industry?
I feel like in so much of our work, it all comes back to being really clear about your objective, and what is it that you're trying to achieve. And so really thinking through that in the context of a partnership, what would it mean to work together, and what is the objective? And that's going to do a few things. I mean, one, it's going to help you actually just assess fit up front, because I think you want to make sure that objective allows for a win-win-win, at least, like both partners involved plus the learners, and maybe a fourth win, employers, who are potentially employing those learners. And I think too, it's also then if you have that clear objective, it's also going to let you weigh other alternatives. Like maybe a partnership is the way to go, maybe not. But again, if you have that objective in mind, then it allows you to sort of weigh your alternatives, assess the risk associated with each one, and figure out if, okay, a partnership actually does make sense, because together we can actually work towards this objective. It benefits both of us, both partners involved to do it. And again, that the learners would actually also hopefully benefit from that as well. So I think, being really clear about that objective, and it might not be clear up front. You don't necessarily have to go to a potential partner with a really clear etched in stone objective. It might be back and forth in a discussion, but you want to get to that clear objective, because that's also going to let you assess success down the road. It'll let you assess fit up front and whether it makes sense to enter into it. And it's going to also let you measure how well you're making progress against that objective. It also may help you determine when a partnership has run its course, right? We've achieved that objective. Now we're kind of done with that. And maybe there's a future partnership, maybe not. But, so super clear on the objective, And then you look at partnership as kind of one of the alternatives and go in kind of eyes wide open with the risks. I know that's all fairly high level and somewhat, generic, but you want to really be looking for, that what benefits everyone. And, we've been talking about certifications. We've been talking about, so if you think about like SHRM or PMI and kind of their certifications and how then those can be stacked into like a master's in project management or HR. I mean, that's a case where then, SHRM partnering with some academic institutions makes a lot of sense because there's value for both SHRM and the academic institution and for that learner, right? Because the certification that they got also then helps them with the degree, helps them with employability. So it really is that sort of win-win-win.
Yeah, I love that. Any other examples you've seen where that's the partnership between two organizations ends up creating sort of more growth and success?
I feel like it's an area where we would love to see more examples and have like more ones to draw on. I mean, I think there's a lot of interest, and I feel like we see, I feel like there's a lot of potential there, but it does seem like it's still an area where it's a little hard to like point to a ton of, successes of like, yeah, this really worked, but I don't know, Jeff, maybe you've thought of something while I said that.
No, I'm struggling to. We need to find at least one or two that we can have on hand for this type of thing, but I don't have one right off the top of my head.
Do you, Kyle? Do you have some?
It's it is a good question. I'll give a little yeah. I have seen cases where multiple organizations get together with a single purpose to create a joint program. Sometimes it's even a joint branded program. Pharmacy is one example where in that world, the national sort of certifying body for the different state licensing boards got together with another organization, and they created a system for kind of unified continuing education. There should be more, I think, overall, especially in this world where the real goal is to help the industry and help the professionals and give value to the members first. There's a lot of potential there, I think, in creating alignments and partnerships to make that happen. Sometimes in cases like working with you, being able to grow value that way ends up being a good route for partnership, and even with temporarily to get to that end goal. Awesome conversation so far. I know we only have a few minutes left. I'll close with one last question, and then we can, if you thought of anything else that you want to share, we can go into that. Are there any good tools, books, other sorts of resources that you suggest folks watching this far in would check out, and how can they learn more and connect with you?
Well, as we shared at one point in the conversation, we have committed to trying to share our knowledge and resources as broadly as possible. So we know not every organization is going to be a consulting client, but through our Leading Learning brand at leadinglearning.com, we've tried to make a lot of resources available. We put out a weekly podcast that talks like each week has a different focus, but we probably have an episode on everything we talked about today. Some, like we certainly have talked about engagement in the past. We've certainly talked about shifts and trends in the industry and things like that. So if folks are audio learners, then that's a great resource. We do also hold periodically Leading Learning webinars for free. And actually we have one focused on engagement coming up. So again, we have a lot of content sort of related to the topics that we talked about today. And we have around what Jeff was talking about with potentially working with your presenters on engagement. We have a course called Presenting for Impact that folks can review and potentially use with their subject matter experts if they want. Jeff, what else would you add?
I think just an extension of what Celisa said. I mean, we have a number of free tools on the Leading Learning site that are easy to get to. If you just go to there's a resources tab in the top of the site. And among those we've created a number of kind of models and frameworks and things like that. We have the learning business maturity model, which really, allows organizations to assess where they are and, get sort of concrete vision into how to move forward. We have tools to help assess your market, to help look at your portfolio and assess it. All of those are there. They're all free. Majority of them don't even require any sign up or anything. They're just there. So we encourage folks to take advantage of them.
Thank you guys, and we'll include links to those. So anything else for the purpose here, and we can stitch anything you say now or earlier too, if you thought of anything you want to add just to close out.
I think one thing that I don't think we really talked about earlier. Forgive me if we didn't, I just missed it. But I mean, the way we look at all of this is we view where we're working as basically the third sector of education. So you've got the first sector, which is K through 12 or pre-K through 12. You've got the second sector, which is, but then you've got this third sector, which is essentially, the other 50 plus years that people have to navigate. It hadn't gotten a lot of attention. Basically, it's starting to finally now as lifelong learning becomes, a bigger thing, but it's huge. I mean, it's a really big part of education. It's a really big part of our lives. I think arguably, not even arguably, it serves more people than any other sector of education. And, the organizations who are listening to this conversation, they're part of that. And I think, part of our mission is to raise the visibility of that, to make it clear that this is such an important sector of education. We're all doing important work. Let's invest in it appropriately. Let's acknowledge that it's there and that it's so vital to our success as individuals, as organizations, as communities and societies going forward.
Yeah, so thank you guys so much. There's a lot to share here. Look forward to sharing it with our community, and we'll be in communication with you both.